In the last part, we finished a very rough version of the level we were building. I also said I'd come back for a second pass on the prototype just to improve how it looks. Right now, it feels pretty flat and a bit dull, so it needs more visual variety. This could really use a bit more polish before we continue. I won't spend too long on this second pass since adding visual detail depends on your own style and design choices. But I still want to show this step because even though this course isn't focused on design theory or what makes a level good, game design itself is always an ongoing process. It's not just about planning, building once, and moving on. We start by making a rough plan, then we test it however we can, and after that we adjust things based on what we learn. So development is really a continuous loop of building, testing, and improving. This approach has proven to be more effective for game design, and it usually leads to stronger results overall. So keep testing, keep looping, and keep refining your levels as you build them. There's no fixed way to add variation here, it's really up to your own approach. But when I hit play and look at the first room, the first thing I notice is that I can already see straight into the next room and there just isn't much visual interest happening. The first change I want to make to add more variety is adjusting the room heights. I'm going to raise and lower certain areas and link them with stairs. That wasn't in the original plan, but after building it in 3D and testing it, it clearly makes sense to add. So don't hesitate to move away from your original layout if it makes the level better. To do this, I'll zoom out. I'm just holding right-click with W to pull out of the scene. This is what the level looks like from the outside, nothing too exciting right now. From here, I'm going to start adjusting the height of these rooms, raising and lowering them to add more variety. I'll start with the first room and lift it up by about 4 meters, which is one wall unit. This keeps everything aligned with the grid we've set up, and I want to stick to that unless there's a good reason not to. I'm raising this room because if I lowered the second one instead, I'd have to lower the rest of the level too just to keep it playable and connected. Raising a single room is just simpler than lowering several of them, so I'll go with that approach. I'll open up the outline and keep it pinned for easier access. Since everything is already neatly organized into folders from the first prototype pass, I can quickly select what I need without much hassle. So what I did was go up to room 1, expand it, and then hold Shift while clicking to select everything inside that folder. That way, I know the entire room is selected. Next, I just need to make sure the grid snap is enabled, and I'll keep the snap distance set to 100. Then I grab the gizmo and move it up 1, 2, 3, 4 units. This shifts the whole room up by exactly 1 wall height since it's snapping to the grid. If I hit play now though, there's an obvious problem. We can just run straight out of the level, which definitely isn't what we want. So the main thing we need to fix is this hallway transition area. Most of the layout can stay as it is, but I'll remove this floor piece and connect the lower and upper levels properly. To do that, I'll create another simple prototype mesh and use it to build a set of stairs. First, I'll just adjust my camera so I can see the area more clearly. If you need to, don't hesitate to hide the ceilings while working. That's exactly why we placed them in a separate subfolder to quickly toggle them on and off so you can see what you're doing. I'll collapse the outline for now and then switch back into modeling mode. This should all feel familiar. It's the same process we used to build the walls, floors, and ceilings. The only difference is that instead of starting with a basic box, I'm going to go down to the stairs option. This is really useful. Epic includes a stair primitive because it's such a common part of level design. If we select the stairs and drag them into the scene, you'll see a preview just like we did with the basic box meshes. Now I'll tweak some of the initial settings. There are quite a few options here. For example, you can even switch the stair type to something like a curve or a spiral. Depending on your level design, there are quite a few options to work with here. I'll stick with a linear stair type since I just need a straight staircase. I did test this a bit off camera, so you might need some extra trial and error if your layout is different and you're not following the same setup. Don't worry about doing a bit of trial and error, that's completely normal. I also adjusted things off camera to get it right. I'm setting the number of steps to 20 to make the staircase longer. Then I'll set the step width to 400, which increases how wide it is. I'm using 400 because it matches 4 meters, the same width as my walls and floor pieces. You can see that when I place it here, it aligns perfectly with the grid lines. I'll keep the step height at 20 and I'll also change the step depth from 30 down to 20. This way, everything fits neatly into the same 4x4 meter grid I've been using for all the other pieces. These stairs are fairly steep, so depending on your level design and the look you're going for, they might feel a bit too sharp. For our character, though, there shouldn't be any functional issue. In most cases, stairs like this are treated almost like a ramp in terms of movement, so the character will move down them without any trouble. It really comes down to aesthetics here. The steepness might not look ideal, but gameplay-wise, it should still work fine. We'll keep all the default settings as they are and make sure Snap to Grid is enabled. If you want, you can also assign a material. I'm going to match it with the same green we used for the floors. Just keep in mind, these colors aren't meant to represent the final look of the level at all. They're only for blocking things out during prototyping. They're mainly just a simple way for me to color code different types of meshes. Anything the character can walk on, like floors, I've set to green, walls are red, and ceilings are blue, for now at least. And of course, you don't have to follow this exactly. You can use any colors you want. If you prefer, you can even match them closer to your final visual style. The reason I use these bright, unusual colors is because I often work in unlit mode. We touched on this briefly when we talked about wireframe view. Here, you can switch shading modes using this icon that says lit. That view shows your level with lighting applied, closer to how it will look in the final game. If you're working in darker areas, it can sometimes be hard to see what's going on. In that case, you can switch from lit to unlit, which gives you flat, solid colors. You can already notice that when the stairs and floor are the same color, it becomes harder to tell which piece is which. And if everything, floors, walls, and ceilings, were all green, it would be even more confusing to read the space and see where one surface ends and another begins. That's the reason I've color-coded everything like this. Anyway, moving on, we've got our stairs set up with the right values. I'll just click to place them and confirm. After that, I'll switch back to lit mode. Now let's open up the content drawer. We can see the new stairs have been created in the Mesh Gen folder alongside the other generated pieces. I'll select them, press F2, and rename the asset by removing the random string so it's just called stairs. And to stay consistent with my naming convention, I'll add 4M to the end since this staircase is 4 meters wide, 4 meters long, and rises 4 meters high. I'll press E, and with snapping set to 10-degree increments, I'll rotate it by 90 degrees so it faces the correct direction. Then I'll press W to bring back the move gizmo and slide it into position. Now if I hit play, you can see we can actually move down the stairs and enter the next room properly. Now there are still some gaps we'll need to fill, but before that I'll organize the stairs properly. I'll open the outline, right-click the stairs we just created, and move them into the Room 1 folder so everything stays clean and organized. Then I'll exit modeling mode for now. That just hides the side panel and gives me more screen space to work with. To fill these gaps, I just need to select the original walls from Room 1 again. I'll hold Alt and drag downward to duplicate them with snapping still enabled. That should fix it quickly. Next, I'll go into the outline and unhide Ceiling 2. You can tell it's hidden because of the closed eye icons next to it. When you press play, anything hidden in the outline is only hidden in the editor. It doesn't remove it from the game. So all those objects are still there when the level runs. To actually remove something from gameplay, you'd need to either delete it completely from the level or, in many cases depending on the actor type, disable it through its settings. In the Details panel, if you search for Hidden, you'll find a Hidden in-game checkbox. If I enable that and press play again, that object will no longer appear in the game. It still exists in the editor, but from the gameplay perspective, it's effectively invisible and not part of the level anymore. So you can see I can still walk over it, but it's no longer visible. I'll undo that change though, we want it visible in the final setup. Now I'll switch the Ceiling 2 layer back on so everything is visible again and I can see what I'm working with. At this point, I might also switch to unlit mode just to get a clearer view of the scene while I continue. It might be tempting to just duplicate this wall, rotate it 90 degrees, and call it done to block all the gaps. But this is where playtesting really matters. If I hit play now, yes, we can still move through the level, but it looks a bit strange and unrefined. It's easier to notice if I place a light here, but since I'm in unlit mode, it doesn't actually affect the scene, so nothing changes visually. So I'll switch back to lit mode to properly see the result. As you can see, the transition feels a bit harsh here. The change in height is quite abrupt and it doesn't look great. If that's the style you want for your level, that's perfectly fine, but in my case, I'm going to smooth it out a bit. I'll soften this drop so it feels more like a natural step or staircase instead of something that just looks like a pit we'd fall into when running up to it. So I'll go ahead and adjust that. I think I'll raise this section by about 2 meters. First, I'll set my snap size back to 100. Then I'll hold Ctrl and press N to snap everything back into alignment, making sure it sits perfectly on the 100 grid line. It just needs to be shifted slightly due to how this level was built. What I'm doing here is making the transition between these two rooms, especially along the ceiling, a bit smoother so it matches the floor change more naturally. Now that this piece is in place, I'll duplicate it, line it up properly, and then duplicate it upward as well. So it's sitting on top of the other piece and I've rotated it, nothing complicated, just a simple adjustment. Now I've got more of a stepped transition leading down into the roof area. I'm noticing a bit of light leaking, so I'll nudge it forward slightly to fix that. Actually, it looks like the leak is coming from that specific spot. And that lines up nicely with the grid as well. Now we've got a more gradual stepping transition going down. Let's hit play and test how it feels. That already feels much better, more like a natural flow between rooms. You might also notice some pieces sticking out on the outside. If you wanted to clean that up, you could always create a custom wall piece, like a 4 meter by 2 meter section, using the same method we've been using for the other modular pieces, and place it there as a separate element. However, because of how this level is designed, we're never actually going to see the exterior in-game. So it's perfectly fine if some pieces stick out or intersect awkwardly on the outside. If the player never sees it, there's no real reason to waste time polishing that part, just focus on what's actually visible and playable. That said, it really depends on the textures you're using. For example, if I had a texture on this wall and I tried to align everything, but the texture looked odd when it got cut off halfway, then it might make sense to create a separate 2x4 wall piece instead. That way you can control how the texture fits and avoid awkward stretching or breaks. And that piece would use its own texture so it tiles cleanly with the rest. We'll go deeper into that in the art assets section of the course, but for now this setup is more than enough. One other thing you might notice here is a bit of Z-fighting. Even though everything is lined up perfectly on the grid, you're seeing that flickering. That happens when two mesh surfaces overlap in the exact same space. In the real world that can't happen, but in a virtual environment it causes this visual glitch. It is possible to build it like this, but Unreal Engine won't know which surface to prioritize, so you get that flickering effect. You can try spending time carefully offsetting things to fix it, but for now I'm just going to avoid the issue by hiding that section instead. This is something level designers do constantly in practice. Next, I'm going to start using columns to hide those seams and areas of Z-fighting, while also breaking up the flatness of these walls visually. Just imagine that later when we bring in the final art assets, these surfaces will likely have some kind of tiled material, like brick or stone, so these structural breaks will actually help the overall look as well. And when you have a large, uninterrupted surface like that, you can start to notice the texture repeating. The more repetition you place side by side without anything to break it up, the more obvious the tiling becomes to the eye. That's why we use extra geometry to break things up and help hide those repeating patterns. It also helps break up the silhouette. Instead of one flat, plain wall, we'll have columns and shapes that stick out and add variation. So the next step is to create a new column piece, since we don't currently have one ready to use here. We'll do this the same way as everything else, nothing new here. I'll switch into modeling mode and select a box. I already tested this a bit, so I know the dimensions I want, 50 cm by 50 cm by 400 cm. I'm using 400 cm because it matches the height of my walls. I don't want to reuse the green here because it's starting to get a bit confusing visually. Instead, I'm going to create a new material for the columns so they stand out clearly from the walls. That way, I can tell what's what at a glance. I'll just hit the reset arrow here to bring it back to the default gray block material that Unreal uses. This is the engine's default look when no material is assigned. I'll place the column here and hit complete. Then I'll open the content drawer, find it in the browser, press F2 and rename it to column 4 since it's 4 meters tall. Now I just need to assign a new material to it. I'll go into the template folder, specifically the level prototyping materials where all the grid materials are stored. I'll pick the green one and duplicate it using Ctrl+D, or you can also right-click and choose Duplicate. Now I'll take that new copy and change it to a purple material. I'll double-click to open the material instance. Under the surface color parameter, I'll choose whatever color I want. In this case, a purple variation looks good. Then I'll hit save in the top left and close it. Now the next step is to assign this material as the default for the column. So every time I drag it in from the content browser, it already has the correct material applied and I don't have to set it manually each time. I'll select it in the level, then hold Ctrl and press B to jump straight to its location in the content browser. Next, I'll double-click it to open it up. In the Material Slots section, I'll open the dropdown and search for purple. It should be the only matching option. Then I'll hit save and close it. The last thing to do before we continue is organize it properly into our folder structure. Right now it's still called Box 26 because I placed it in the world before renaming it in the mesh generator. At this point, you can either rename it directly in the outline, duplicate it from there, or simply delete it and bring it back in cleanly from the content browser. It should now be named Column since that's the name we assigned. I'll move it into the correct folder, then I'll quickly double-check everything by collapsing all the folders. I can see there are a few spline or point items that aren't assigned to any folder. I'll select one of them in the outline and press F to focus on it so I can easily see where it is in the level. I can see it belongs to room 5. These are the lights I added at the end of the last video. I also placed a couple more off camera to help with visibility in darker areas. It looks like I just put one of them in the wrong folder, so I'll move it into room 3. And the last one is the one I just added here, just to help visualize this ceiling section. I'll move it into room 1. Now I'll switch back to lit mode. Sometimes unlit or grid views make it harder to judge depth properly, so lit gives a clearer sense of the space. From here, I'll start placing these pieces roughly where they make sense. I'm using them not only to hide seams and fix Z-fighting, but also to break up the repetition in the room and add more visual interest. So I'm not worrying too much about perfect grid alignment for these. I'm still keeping grids snapping on, but I'm mainly placing them where they make the most sense visually. For columns especially, it's more about breaking up the space than strict alignment. I'll just move my light around a bit so I can see the scene more clearly while I work. I usually place them in corners, especially outer corners. When you look at areas like this, those hard 90-degree edges from two separate pieces can feel very sharp and unnatural. That kind of harsh angle can break realism a bit, so you have a couple of options. You can either hide it with columns, or you can create a dedicated corner piece with a beveled edge to smooth the transition. At the end of the day, it's all personal preference. I prefer to hide those problem areas using columns. And like I said, this setup also really needs better lighting, but none of this is even close to the final look anyway. It's just for readability while I work. So if it only takes a moment to move a light slightly so you can see better, there's no downside to doing it. Now, if you're spending too much time constantly moving lights just to see what you're doing, it's usually a sign you should just add a couple more. Speaking of lighting, I'm having trouble seeing into all the corners while I build, so I'll select this light and open the Details panel. Here, where it says Attenuation Radius, currently set to 1000, this basically controls how far the light reaches. So if I want the light to reach farther into the corners, I can simply click and drag this value up. As I adjust it, you can see the radius expanding and contracting in real time, and the corners become better lit. You don't want to rely on too many lights in a scene, especially ones with large attenuation ranges, because that can quickly become inefficient and harder to manage. If you overlap too many lights, you can run into serious performance drops. So if things start feeling laggy even just in the editor, it's worth checking your lighting setup. Make sure you're not using more lights than you actually need, because calculating all those light interactions and bounces can be quite heavy on your system. Even a simple scene can become taxing if it's overlit, and your machine will start working a lot harder than necessary. Same idea here. I'm going to start placing columns to hide those problem areas and clean things up visually, switching between lit and unlit mode as needed. These ones are actually sitting more in room 2 than room 1, so I'll just select them and move them over into the correct position. And just like before, you can also duplicate multiple pieces at once when they're all selected, which makes the process much faster. That's not an issue, and just like with the walls, instead of building a separate 2-meter column piece, I'll keep it simple since we're never going to see the exterior. I don't expect any major conflicts here, so I'll just duplicate this upward. It might stick through the top a bit, but that's completely fine. We'll never see those hidden intersections in the final result anyway. I'm still seeing a bit of Z-fighting, so I'll just nudge this over until it properly aligns. Small adjustments like this help clean it up. I might also temporarily lower my snap distance to 1 so I can place it more precisely. In some cases, you'll notice the pieces you've created just don't quite fit the situation. When that happens, you've got two options. Either create a column with a different size or use a slightly more hacky workaround if you just need a quick fix. But if the difference is small, you can just scale the piece instead. I'll switch to the scale tool and reduce my snapping increment so I can fine-tune it until it fits neatly between the surrounding pieces. One quick warning though, scaling can sometimes cause issues. It's not obvious right now because we're using object-aligned materials, but it can become a problem depending on how textures and assets are set up. But with standard art assets, you generally don't want to scale them heavily inside the level because that will stretch the textures. For example, if this had a stone material on it and I scaled it too much to fill a gap, the texture would either get stretched or squashed. That would become very noticeable, especially if it's sitting next to other pieces that haven't been scaled. If it's only a small adjustment, players usually won't notice it in-game. But it really depends on the situation. There's no strict rule for how much scaling is too much. It's mostly up to you as the designer and artist to judge what still looks good and what starts to break the visual quality. As a general rule, I try not to scale anything beyond about 1.1 or 1.2 of its original size. The default scale for every mesh should stay at 1. So if I start scaling this out along the y-axis, you can see it's already gone past 1.2 with just that small adjustment. So generally, I avoid scaling anything beyond about 1.2. If I ever need more than that, I'll usually just create a new mesh piece instead so I don't end up stretching anything. That's more of an art production rule, but even in prototyping, it's important not to build bad habits early on. Otherwise, when you move into the art creation phase, you might end up having to redo a lot of work, which we definitely want to avoid. I'm going to split the difference here and place it halfway across this gap, then pull it down into position. I'll switch back to lit mode so I can see the scene more clearly and bring the view over a bit. If the lighting still feels too weak, you can also adjust it directly in the details panel. For this light, the default intensity is set to 8 candelas. You can either type the value in manually or drag the slider to adjust it. If you push it too high, it obviously becomes completely blown out. Now the next thing I want to fix as we move forward is this bottomless pit area. If I hit play from here, you can see that while it is technically bottomless, because if the character falls in, they'll just fall out of the world indefinitely. We obviously don't want that in the final setup. We don't really want to see the sky underneath here. Instead, it should feel like the player is falling into a dark void. So the first thing I'll do is take these wall pieces, make sure snapping is set correctly, and then simply duplicate them downward a few times to block that area off. So I'll go one more step and select all these bottom pieces, then press W and Alt to duplicate them. I did lose my gizmo for a moment, but that's not a problem. The duplicates are still there. I just need to reposition them correctly. I'll shift everything one more time away from the edge. That looks good enough for now. In a real game, you probably wouldn't even see this kind of angle anyway, and you'd usually restrict the camera so players can't look into areas like this or break the intended view. The last thing I want to do here is actually give this a bottom, even though it's meant to be a bottomless pit. Right now we're getting a lot of unwanted light bleeding in from the outside world since there's a sky and sun in the scene, and I don't want this area to look bright or open. I'll switch to unlit mode for a moment so it's easier to work. In this mode, the sky disappears because it's part of the lighting setup. Now I'll take this 4-meter floor piece, bring it in, and place it at the bottom of the pit. After duplicating and positioning it, I'll check the result. If I jump in and hit play from here, we'll see what it looks like in-game. Now the bottom is clearly visible, so it's definitely not feeling like a bottomless pit anymore. This happens because of Unreal's lighting system. Everything is being lit realistically with light bounces and sky contribution, which naturally exposes that floor. So I'm going to cheat a bit here to fix it. I'll darken these surfaces, turning them black so they don't draw the player's attention as much and the pit feels deeper and less readable. So I'm going to go back into my prototyping materials and duplicate the green material using Ctrl+D, then I'll turn that into a black grid material. You can even remove the grid lines completely and just keep it fully black if you want, but this works fine for now. Now if I apply this black material to my mesh and save it, it's important to note that it will update every instance of that material in the level, which is not what we want. Keep in mind that if you change the material inside the static mesh editor, which opens when you double-click a static mesh asset, you're changing the default assignment. That means every instance of that mesh in your level will update, which is not what we want here. So I'll go back into the static mesh editor and switch it back to the green material. But we don't have to stick with the default on every instance of the mesh. That's why we can override materials per placement. So instead, I'll just select the specific pieces in the level that I want to change. Then I'll open the Details panel, go to the Materials section, and search for Black Prototype Grid to apply that black material only to these selected meshes. So only those selected pieces get updated, and now the ones in the pit are black while the rest stay green. If I hit play again from here, when we reach the edge of the pit, there is technically a bottom, but from above you can't really see it anymore because of how the lighting and materials are set up. You could even extend the walls down one more level before adding the floor if you wanted to push that bottomless pit feeling further. That would work fine too. But even as it is now, it already feels a lot better. We're around the 40-minute mark, so I'm going to take a quick break here. When we come back, we'll continue with the second pass of the level prototype.